Welcome! If you're here for the breakdown of the Silent City, the Anomaly Vector, Episode 5, and if you don't want to miss the most intense, dimensional combat moments of the story, you need to tap the subscribe button and the bell icon right now. Remember, you shouldn't miss a single moment of this cosmic journey. Ready? Then let's get into this Anomaly Vector analysis. The instant the world shattered into cascading layers of light and void, Lina felt her consciousness stretched across an impossible spectrum, as though every fiber of her being were being unraveled, duplicated, inverted, and reassembled in the same breath, and the violent surge that detonated through her upon touching the entity's shadow-wrapped tendrils now expanded into a tidal wave that hurled her into a dimension of shifting vectors and spiraling geometric illusions, where gravity fractured in spirals and time flickered like a damaged reel. She reached blindly for anything to anchor herself, but her hands passed through translucent planes that rippled like liquid glass, each touch triggering bursts of images, cities suspended in mid-air, colossal machines grinding through metallic horizons, broken towers rotating in slow circles around a core of blinding radiance, and silhouettes like the one she touched drifting through the void like wandering echoes. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed into the distortion, spreading outward as a spiral of luminous threads, and she felt the presence of the shadow entity tethered to her still, its essence pulling her through the disintegrating layers of reality, guiding and restraining her as the fissure's energy carved a path through the collapsing dimensional seam. Suddenly, the endless cascade of light snapped into a narrow corridor of darkness streaked with machine-like veins of blue fire, and Lina felt her feet slam onto a solid surface, her legs buckling as she stumbled forward into a cavernous expanse that seemed simultaneously infinite and claustrophobic. Its architecture, a skeletal labyrinth of metallic spires and shifting panels that reconfigured themselves with an insect-like click each time she moved. Behind her, the fissure sealed itself with a crack like distant thunder, and only the lingering luminescent dust swirling around her fingers proved the explosion had occurred at all. But she barely had time to breathe before the silhouette materialized again, its form coalescing from drifting fragments of shadow that stitched themselves together with fluid, unsettling precision, until the figure stood upright before her, tall, faceless, its presence generating a pressure in the air that made the metal beneath her vibrate. She took a step back, but the chamber reacted instantly, its walls constricting in a slow, serpentine rotation that pushed her forward, funneling her toward the entity as though the environment itself denied the possibility of retreat. The silhouette raised its arm, not threateningly, but with a slow, deliberate motion that resonated with the same harmonic signature she had heard through the fissure, and suddenly the ground beneath them dissolved into a transparent platform suspended above an abyss of swirling clouds and drifting monolithic shards of stone, each shard engraved with markings that pulsed like tiny internal suns. Lina's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she inched toward the platform's edge, staring downward into the abyss that seemed to stretch into eternity. And yet when she looked up, the entity was no longer in front of her but beside her, its presence somehow both silent and impossibly loud, as though its thoughts were pressing against the surface of her mind. Then, with no warning, the platform lurched, tilting violently as enormous mechanical arms, massive segmented constructs emerging from the abyss, began locking into position around them, forming a rotating spiral cage that trapped them within a narrowing helix of metal and light. Lina braced herself, gripping the edge of the platform as wind roared upward, stirring her coat like tattered wings, and the silhouetted figure extended its arm toward the central void of the mechanical helix, triggering a cascade of activation lights that raced across the metal in rapid pulses. The entire structure shuddered, and then she felt it, a pull far stronger than gravity, a suction that tugged at her bones, her memories, her breath, drawing her toward the swirling core at the heart of the helix, a core that was expanding into a vortex of spiraling equations and flickering star-like particles, as though the chamber were awakening something primordial hidden at the center of this machine world. Lina clawed her fingers against the platform, fighting the pull, but the vortex intensified with each passing second, and the shadow entity remained motionless beside her, its posture unreadable, its form rippling with faint pulses that suggested communication but delivered no clear meaning. The light in the vortex intensified until it became a star blooming in front of her, and when the pull became too strong to resist, Lina felt her feet slip, her body swept upward toward the spiraling singularity, and in the instant before she was engulfed, she saw the silhouette step into the vortex voluntarily, as if leading her into whatever lay beyond. Lina's body shot through the vortex in a violent spiral of pressure, light, and crushing silence. Her consciousness stretched thin as the swirling core fractured into rapid pulses that alternated between blinding brilliance and total void, and for a moment, she felt as though she were dissolving into threads of memory, each strand flickering with fragments of her past, distorted echoes of voices, fractured glimpses of moments she could no longer tell were real. before the vortex constricted around her like a colossal throat, compressing her into a narrow beam of light that pierced through a membrane of crackling energy, and expelled her into a cavernous expanse where she slammed onto a shifting metallic surface that rippled beneath her like a living sheet of steel. Gasping, she tried to rise, but gravity itself seemed unstable, swinging between oppressive weight and floaty resistance as the environment reconfigured. Panels unfolding like petals around her into spiraling tiers that formed a dizzying arena of rotating machinery, each segment lined with glowing runes that pulsed in synchronization with the deep mechanical heartbeat vibrating through the floor. Above her, the vortex sealed itself into a roaring sphere of spiraling equations, then collapsed inward with a thunderous implosion, dropping the shadow silhouette beside her, the figure landing without a sound, its limbs bending and straightening with a fluidity that defied anatomy, its faceless head turning toward her with an unreadable tilt as though analyzing not just her physical state, but the faint distortions still clinging to her from the dimensional crossing. She pushed herself up, the metal beneath her shifting to accommodate her weight as though the terrain recognized her presence, and around them towering monoliths rose from the arena's outer edge like colossal spines, their surfaces carved with symbols that ignited one by one in a cascading sweep of red illumination, sending waves of energy rippling inward until they converged at the center where Lina stood, causing a low tremor that nearly knocked her off her feet. She reached instinctively for something, anything, to steady herself, but the air twisted before her, forming a shimmering barrier that parted like a curtain as mechanical limbs descended from above, massive segmented constructs with claw-like ends that stabbed into the shifting floor and locked into place, forming a vast circular frame that began tightening around the arena like a mechanical iris. The silhouette stepped forward, its outline flickering with faint pulses of inner light, and extended one elongated arm toward the center of the arena, triggering a surge of kinetic force that swept outward in a spiraling wave, reorganizing the shifting plates into a precise geometry, flattening the floor into an intricate grid of interlocking segments that glowed with pale blue radiance. Lina staggered back as the ground vibrated, then dropped away beneath her feet, reshaping itself into a descending platform that carried her toward the arena's heart, the silhouette descending beside her as though weightless, drifting with liquid motion even as the mechanical iris tightened above them until only a narrow circle of red illumination remained. The deeper they went, the more the air thickened with charged particles that stung her skin, and the metal around them changed texture, shifting from smooth polished steel to a dark, matte alloy marked with faintly glowing channels that pulsed like circulating veins. Lina exhaled sharply as a pressure built in her chest, as if the chamber itself were testing her, scanning her, rooting through the very architecture of her thoughts as the platform reached the bottom. A vast undulating floor of obsidian black metal that reflected nothing. In the center of the floor, a rising column formed itself from countless interlocking shards, assembling into a towering spire that cracked open along its seams to reveal a core of swirling luminescence, its inner surface etched with shifting symbols that rotated like orbiting planets. The silhouette moved ahead, its shadow trailing behind it in elongated streaks that flickered as though detached from the floor, and when it reached the spire, it pressed its hand against the glowing core, causing the chamber to resonate with a deep, harmonic tone that vibrated straight into Lina's bones. Before she could react, the floor lurched, then split outward in concentric circles, revealing a plunging pit of spiraling darkness, and an enormous mechanical structure began rising. An immense circular frame with rotating layers that moved independently like concentric rings of a colossal celestial instrument, all centered on a pitch-black sphere suspended within a web of crackling energy. The silhouette withdrew its hand from the spire and gestured toward the sphere, its intent unclear, but the instant Lina stepped closer, the sphere reacted, expanding with a sudden pulse that distorted the air, pulling her forward as though her presence alone had activated it. She dug her heels into the trembling floor, but the pull intensified. Her body dragged toward the sphere as its surface rippled like liquid darkness, and just as her fingertips brushed its gravitational shell, the silhouette materialized behind her, placing a shadowy hand on her shoulder, its touch cold, grounding, and impossibly ancient, and the world around them detonated into a soundless explosion of light and darkness as the sphere swallowed them both whole. The moment the sphere swallowed them, Lina expected the crushing pressure of oblivion, but instead she felt a strange, weightless suspension, as if she had been pinned between moments rather than obliterated by them. The darkness around her was not empty, but dense, textured, alive with faint ripples that moved like slow waves through ink, each disturbance carrying with it a distant echo of sound, murmurs, half-formed words, the broken rhythm of laughter abruptly cut short, the sharp intake of breath before a scream that never finished, an ocean of aborted instants suspended in an endless midnight. She tried to move, only to realize she had no clear sense of where her limbs began or ended. Her body felt like a silhouette drawn in negative space, a shape outlined by pressure rather than light, yet she could still feel the weight of herself, her choices, her regret, the phantom burden of the timeline she had severed, pressing against the unseen boundaries of this place. Slowly, faint lines of dim gray light emerged in the void, sketching out the thinnest suggestion of a floor that wasn't really a floor, more like a conceptual plane that decided, in this moment, to support her. Lina staggered forward, her bootsteps making no sound, yet she could feel impact, feel the echo of contact travel outward as concentric rings through the darkness. Ahead, something stirred. The shadow entity was no longer beside her but diffused throughout the space, its presence fragmented into multiple overlapping silhouettes that lingered at the edges of perception, always at the corner of her vision, never fully forming when she turned. When it finally chose to cohere, it did so at a distance, resolving into a towering, featureless humanoid outline that seemed carved from a deeper shade of black than the surrounding void, as if it were an absence layered atop absence. Above it, and then around them both, countless vertical bands of faint light snapped into existence like towering, transparent pillars stretching into infinity, each band filled with translucent images sliding past at incomprehensible speed, cities folding into themselves, towers submerged under slow tides of ash, skies split open by spiraling machines, unknown faces caught mid-sentence and erased the next instant. Lina realized with a sick lurch that these were timelines, or at least echoes of them, every possible continuation running alongside every possible ending, each strip humming with an almost inaudible tone that together formed a dissonant choir of unrealized futures. She whispered, "What is this?" And for the first time the entity responded not with pressure against her thoughts but with a voice, if it could be called that, curling through the darkness like a low, resonant chord. "Archive," it said, the single word unfurling into a cascade of meaning that pressed against her ribs. "You cut one thread," the system responds. "It must reconcile the remainder." The bands of light thickened, slowing until individual images became visible. There she was, walking corridors she had never entered, speaking to people she had never met, facing versions of the Reclaimer that were smaller, larger, more grotesquely evolved. In other strips, she never reached the Silent City at all. In still others, she never left it. Each variation pulsed, evaluated, and either dimmed or brightened as if weighed by an unseen algorithm. Guilt rose in her throat, thick and bitter. "What did I erase?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she expected. The entity stepped forward, the pillars of light bending subtly away from it as though unwilling to intersect its form. "Not erase," it replied. "Remove from dominant resolution. It remains as pressure, as noise, as hunger." Hunger. She understood that word all too well now, could feel it radiating from the void, the restless agitation of unselected paths gnawing at the edges of the chosen timeline, trying to claw their way back into relevance through anomalies, distortions, monsters like the Reclaimer. "So this is what it feeds on," she murmured, watching one strip flicker and shiver as a shadow, recognizably the Reclaimer, moved between layers, chewing at their borders. On what was denied, the entity tilted its head, acknowledging. "Your axis strengthened one strand but starved many. The tension must go somewhere." The sphere's darkness pulsed faintly, and the pillars of light drew closer, forming a narrowing canyon of possibilities. Lina felt the pressure again. This time not from the entity, but from the archive itself, an expectant wait, the sense of a question forming. The silhouette raised its arm and, with one slow, deliberate gesture, sliced its hand through a nearby band. The strip shuddered, froze, then expanded outward in front of Lina like a translucent curtain. She saw herself in a version of the Silent City that had never fully fallen, walking alongside figures whose faces were wholly unknown and yet emotionally familiar, their voices reaching her as muffled echoes of camaraderie, loss, and something frighteningly close to peace. The image stuttered, then shattered into a cloud of dim fragments that dissolved into the black. "Option," the entity said. "Pressure release. You may cut again, or you may bind." Lina swallowed. Her grip tightened instinctively on the memory of the blade she'd wielded before. Though no weapon had followed her into this place, only its phantom weight lived in her muscles. "Bind what?" she asked. The archive responded, not in words but in motion. Bands of light curved inward, intersections appearing where they had been parallel, crossing points forming like luminous knots. She saw glimpses of herself and the Reclaimer occupying the same scene without hostility, of the city half ruined but stabilized, of timelines that did not collapse but brazed against one another, mutually constrained. "Bind divergence. Convince hunger to sleep," the entity intoned. "But cost remains. Binding is not mercy. It is containment. It is turning open sky into a locked room." Across the archive, Some bands flickered out entirely. Others grew almost painfully bright. Lina realized this was the choice the sphere had carried her here to confront. Not simply whether to prune, but whether to fuse, accepting a messier, more haunted equilibrium instead of a clean, surgical cut that left ghosts screaming outside the walls. The entity stepped closer, its shadow merging with the darkness at her feet. "You were chosen because you remember," it said. "Because you resist forgetting what the system prefers to discard." The implication chilled her. "So what happens?" she asked quietly. "If I refuse? If I don't prune again? If I don't bind anything?" For the first time since arriving, the archive stilled. The pillars stopped. The hum flattened into a single, thin, almost inaudible tone. "Then instability grows," the entity answered. "Reclaimers multiply. Silent cities spread. The fracture ceases to be local. It becomes weather." Lina pictured it then. The phenomenon she'd already seen in Antarctic ice, in the distortion storms, scaled up, proliferating, reality crumbling in patches, then continents, then entire planetary lattices. Hunger unbounded. No longer anomaly, but climate. The choice was hideous. She closed her eyes, fingertips tingling as latent strands of memory, hers and not hers, flared within her like constellations. Somewhere, far outside the sphere, people went about their lives unaware that their future was hanging on a decision being made in a place they would never know existed. When she opened her eyes again, the entity had extended both arms, and between its hands a new construct had formed, a thin, glowing ring of braided timelines, each thread flickering with images like tiny embedded screens. It hovered between them, trembling. "This is the compromise," it said. "A bound storm. Controlled anomaly. A silent city that never fully empties, because its emptiness becomes the wall that holds the others back." Lina's throat ached as she whispered, "You want me to turn my world into a containment field?" "It is already becoming one," the entity replied. "You are being asked to decide whether that happens with intention." The ring drifted toward her, hovering at chest level. All around, the archive's bands of light began to withdraw into the darkness, as if granting privacy to the moment. Lina stared at the ring, at the miniature lives shimmering along its circumference. "If I take it," she asked, "what do I become?" The entity regarded her in silence, its head tilting just slightly. When it finally spoke, the word was soft, heavy, and inescapable. "Anchor." The black sphere pulsed. The ring pulsed in answer. And Lina reached out, knowing there was no version of this choice that left her untouched. As the chamber's trembling aftershock faded from the last line of Part 83, the air around the featureless silhouette rippled with a pressure that felt as if the world itself were inhaling, pulling every shadow tighter before releasing them in a slow exhale that reshaped the room's geometry. The floor stretched outward like liquid glass, the walls retracting into an impossible vanishing point, and the halo of fractured light that had hovered above the silhouette's head pulsed violently, as if resisting an unseen command. A low mechanical groan threaded through the silence, something vast awakening beneath the surface. And with each vibration the silhouette felt the gravitational pull of an unseen force trying to wrench them backward, as though the timeline behind them were attempting to reclaim its missing piece. Yet forward, beyond the expanding threshold, an iridescent corridor formed, bending in spirals that obeyed no physics known to the living. The silhouette stepped toward it, boots echoing with a hollow resonance that bounced back distorted, mimicking whispers of words they had never spoken. The air thickened. The corridor's walls flickered with ghost-like silhouettes trapped in loops of their past actions, each repeating a gesture or breath as if carved from memory. When the silhouette reached a sharp turn, the spiral constricted, threatening to close around them, but the halo above flared, an eruption of silver-blue shards, forcing the corridor to split open into a wide atrium where a colossal mechanical monolith hovered, suspended by magnetic fields that hummed like a distant storm. Its surface was carved with shifting symbols, flickering in and out of visibility, and when the silhouette drew near, the monolith rotated, revealing a fissure that pulsed like a heartbeat. Suddenly, the ground convulsed, sending shockwaves racing up the structure. The fissure widened, releasing a torrent of luminous particles that swirled around the silhouette in a cyclone of shimmering chaos. Each particle flashed visions, fragments of alternate timelines, broken choices, futures that looped back on themselves, until the cyclone tightened and shot upward, carrying the silhouette with it into a spiraling ascent. The atrium blurred beneath them, the monolith shrinking to a pinpoint of light as an unseen aperture opened overhead, snapping like a mechanical iris. The silhouette was thrust through, plunged into a chamber of absolute darkness punctured by thin veins of crimson light. The air tasted metallic, charged with anticipation, and something enormous shifted in the void, its outline barely perceptible yet unmistakably aware of the silhouette's arrival. The crimson veins expanded, illuminating a towering archway ahead, its interior swirling with a storm of data threads and collapsing geometries. A voice, synthetic yet resonant, vibrated through the void, saying nothing in words yet communicating everything. Step through or be rewritten. The silhouettes steadied themselves, the halo dimming to a low, steady glow, and moved forward as the archway's storm intensified, tearing at their outline, stretching them in impossible directions. A final surge of force yanked them across the threshold. Light exploded outward, and the world inverted. Then everything stopped. Absolute stillness. A silence so complete it felt sculpted. And in that silence, something new began to take shape around them. An almost imperceptible vibration that grew into a resonant hum, as though the void itself were recalibrating to accommodate the silhouette's presence, and the darkness folded inward, compressing into thin vertical fractures of pale luminescence that then erupted outward in slow, gravitational waves. These waves rolled across the unseen floor, revealing a vast expanse of translucent material beneath, shimmering like frozen mist, and with each pulse the silhouette's shadows stretched and contorted along the surface, elongating into impossible angles as if the geometry of their existence were being rewritten in real time. The air thickened with a metallic tang, and from the far edge of the chamber a towering structure emerged, its form assembling piece by piece from ribbons of light that snapped into place with sharp, precise clicks, forming something akin to a colossal crystalline archway suspended above a churning vortex of swirling data threads. The vortex rotated slowly at first, then accelerated, rising like a tornado of symbols that shifted between familiar and entirely alien alphabets, each fragment sparking against the silhouette's halo as though recognizing or challenging its authority. A deep tremor shuddered through the chamber, and the archway flared with violent iridescence. The vortex surged upward and struck its underside, sending shockwaves rippling through the void and forcing the silhouette to brace against the invisible wind that whipped around them in spirals of distorted gravity. Suddenly a chorus of whisper-like echoes rose from the swirling data, fragments of voices layered over one another, not speaking but conveying emotional weight, urgency, warning, inevitability, and as they merged into a single tonal vibration, the chamber's fractures of light snapped into lines that converged into a grid beneath the silhouette's feet, igniting the floor with a complex circuitry pattern that spiraled outward in concentric rings. The halo hovering above their head pulsed in response, then projected a narrow beam downward into the center of the grid, triggering a cascade of light that transformed the floor into a reflective mirror of the silhouette's outline. But the reflection moved independently, shifting into a stance the silhouette had not taken, turning its head toward the vortex with an eerie slowness. The reflection raised an arm, pointed toward the crystalline archway, and the moment the silhouette instinctively followed its silent directive, the vortex's winds parted, revealing a core of dense darkness at its center, an anomaly so absolute it appeared to devour even conceptual light. The archway's edges crackled with surges of electric blue energy, forming runes that pulsed in a heartbeat-like rhythm, and the chamber itself began to rotate, not physically but perceptually, as though some higher dimensional axis were shifting into alignment. The silhouette stepped forward, each motion bending the grid beneath them as if time folded under their weight, and when they reached the archway's threshold, the vortex surged once more, extending a tendril of swirling data that coiled around their arm like a living cable, transmitting images, colliding timelines, shattered sequences, choices yet unmade, and a final image of the chamber cracking apart. A thunderous shockwave hit as the tendril snapped, launching the silhouette into the center of the vortex, where gravity inverted, vision fractured, and all sense of orientation dissolved into cascading shards of light and shadow. Then the darkness folded once more, sealing behind them like an eyelid closing over a dream, and a new environment began to coalesce around their falling form. As the new environment solidified around the silhouette's falling form, gravity snapped back into place with a low, resonant thud that rippled through the unseen ground, and the swirling shards of light and shadow reassembled into a colossal corridor that stretched infinitely in both directions, its walls composed of interlocking plates of dark metallic glass that reflected distorted echoes of timelines the silhouette had never lived yet somehow recognized. Each step they took caused the corridor's surface to shimmer like rippling water, and from these ripples rose faint illusions, glimpses of alternate selves moving independently before dissolving into static. A cold current of air swept through the vast passage, carrying with it faint harmonic tones like distant bells chiming in different dimensions, and the floor beneath them shifted into a lattice of glowing veins, each pulse sending data like sparks across the mirrored walls. Above, the ceiling spiraled upward into a vortex of geometric shapes folding into themselves, forming intricate patterns that rearranged every few seconds as if trying to decode the silhouette's presence. Suddenly, the corridor convulsed, and from the left wall a massive fissure tore open, releasing a torrent of swirling darkness that writhed like ink in water, forming a towering humanoid figure whose outline flickered with glitch-like distortions. The being's faceless head tilted toward the silhouette, emitting a low-frequency hum that vibrated the entire corridor, bending the reflections on the walls into spiraling whirlpools. The silhouette's halo pulsed defensively, projecting a thin sphere of shimmering light around them, but the humanoid mass extended an arm composed of shifting shadows that elongated across the corridor like a living spear. Before it struck, the floor erupted into concentric rings of radiance that disrupted the entity's attack, forcing it to recoil with a roar that echoed in every direction at once. More fissures erupted along the corridor, releasing smaller shadow constructs that crawled along the walls and ceiling, their movements synchronized like a swarm with shared intent. The silhouette moved forward, and the corridor responded. The plates of dark glass rearranged, sliding into new shapes that formed a narrow path illuminated by cascading lines of crystalline white energy. Yet behind them, the swarm coalesced, merging into a vortex that accelerated toward the silhouette with predatory precision. Instinctively, the silhouette reached toward the shifting ceiling, and a fragment of geometric pattern detached, falling into their grasp as a sphere of condensed spatial code. When they hurled it toward the rushing vortex, the sphere expanded mid-air into a spiraling disk of refracted light that cleaved through the swarm, scattering the shadow constructs into streaks of fading static. But as the light dissipated, the towering fisher-born humanoid surged forward, striking the floor with both hands and triggering a shockwave that collapsed the corridor's distant edges, causing them to fold inward like closing wings. The silhouette sprinted along the narrowing path as the environment warped violently, walls bending, ceiling twisting, shadows compressing into razor-thin streams that snapped at their heels. At the corridor's far end, a circular aperture of swirling silver light manifested, rotating at impossible speed, its gravitational pull distorting the corridor's geometry. The silhouette leaped toward it mere seconds before the shadow humanoid reached them, and as their body passed through the aperture, the corridor imploded behind them with a deafening surge of collapsing timelines, sealing shut just as they were flung into whatever awaited beyond. The silhouette erupted from the collapsing aperture and was hurled into a spiraling void of fractured starlight, tumbling through a vortex that stretched into a colossal tunnel composed of layered temporal currents, each stream pulsing with its own rhythm like overlapping heartbeats from different universes. And as they spun weightlessly, the shards of timelines past and future flickered around them, cities rising and falling in seconds, oceans draining into nothingness before swelling again, silhouettes of unrecognizable entities drifting through reality's edges like drifting embers. A gravitational swell seized them, pulling their form downward into a narrowing funnel where the swirling light abruptly warped into a transparent membrane vibrating like a living drum. And before they could brace themselves, the membrane snapped inward and launched them into a vast abyssal chamber suspended between dimensions. The chamber's walls were impossibly tall monoliths of smooth obsidian, etched with glowing runes that pulsated in synchronized waves as if whispering instructions to the fabric of the void itself. Beneath the silhouette's feet, a floating platform assembled molecule by molecule, forming a tessellated pattern of interlocking hexagonal tiles that rotated in constant motion, emitting soft murmurs like machinery thinking aloud. A deep resonance echoed from the chamber's unseen depths, and the monoliths shifted, sliding apart to reveal elongated fissures from which tendrils of translucent shadow emerged, weaving together into a massive serpent-like construct with no face, no scales, only a smooth featureless surface that bent light around its own body. The construct lowered itself toward the silhouette, its presence pressing down like the weight of a collapsed star, and when it exhaled, the air trembled with vibrations that carried fragmented voices, echoes of the silhouette's past choices, each diverging pathway layered atop another like overlapping ghostly murmurs. The silhouette stepped back, and the platform reacted by expanding into an intricate labyrinth of shifting rings and spirals that extended into the abyss, creating a moving puzzle of pathways that rearranged themselves with every second. The serpent construct lunged without warning, its elongated form sweeping through the air with impossible speed, but the silhouette leaped across rotating platforms, each tile lighting up with data lines as they landed, projecting holographic trails behind them. The chamber darkened suddenly as the monoliths dimmed, and the labyrinth accelerated its rotations, forcing the silhouette into a desperate sprint as pathways flickered out of existence behind them. The serpent's body split into multiple intertwined strands, each one pursuing from different angles, weaving through the spiraling geometry like lightning snakes, and the silhouette responded instinctively by raising a hand to summon a ripple of condensed spatial energy that burst outward in a spiral of refracted light, temporarily scattering the serpent strands into vibrating fragments. But the reprieve lasted only a heartbeat. The monoliths trembled, runes flaring white-hot, and the fragments reassembled into a towering form that filled half the chamber, lowering its immense head toward the silhouette's platform. With a thunderous roar that shook every tile in the labyrinth, the construct slammed its body downward, collapsing vast sections of the pathways and sending debris spinning into the abyss. The silhouette dashed across the breaking platforms, their movements synchronized with the labyrinth's shifting rhythm, until a glowing seam of reality cracked open ahead, an elliptical tear emitting a storm of silver sparks. The serpent reared back for a final strike, its whole form coiling like a cosmic spring, but the silhouette hurled themselves toward the seam just as the construct descended, its shadow swallowing half the chamber. As the silhouette passed through the tear, their form dissolved into streaming particles, pulled into whatever lay beyond while the chamber collapsed in a tidal wave of collapsing geometry behind them. The silhouette's particles reassembled with a violent jolt as they were expelled from the collapsing seam and hurled into an infinite corridor of shifting geometric planes that stretched in every direction like an elaborate cosmic labyrinth, suspended in a vacuum of pale luminescence, and before they could stabilize, the corridor itself bent around them, surfaces folding inward like origami guided by an unseen intelligence, forcing the silhouette into a rapid slide along a seamless slope of liquid crystal that shifted color with each breath. They collided with a floating platform that unfolded from the void, its surface composed of concentric rings that rotated in opposite directions while generating a constant hum that resonated through the silhouette's entire structure, like a tuning fork seeking a frequency that did not yet exist. Suddenly the ambient glow dimmed, and countless specks of black dust surged upward from the void below, swirling together into a towering column that solidified into a humanoid shape composed entirely of negative space, its edges flickering like a glitch in reality, its limbs elongated beyond anatomical logic. The silhouette stood their ground as the entity's featureless head tilted, emitting a deep vibration that pulsed outward in concentric waves, warping the corridor walls until they appeared to melt like heated metal. With a sudden lurch, the column being extended an arm that elongated into a whip of pure absence, striking the platform with a crack that sent it splitting into overlapping layers that rotated away into the void. The silhouette leaped across the collapsing fragments, landing on a narrow beam of light that formed under their feet only 1 second before it would have been too late, and an instantaneous flash revealed that the corridor was not empty. Parallel versions of themselves flickered momentarily in the distance, all running in different directions along branching beams of light that diverged and reconnected across the infinite landscape. A violent tremor passed through the entire plane as the column being roared, its body unraveling into dozens of swirling ribbons that pursued each version of the silhouette simultaneously, hunting across multiple timelines in a synchronized chase. The primary silhouette sprinted along the beam as reality folded around them, beams intersecting at impossible angles as if geometry itself were improvising new rules to contain the battle. A spiraling cyclone of fractured mirrors erupted ahead, each shard displaying a distorted future, some apocalyptic, some serene, some unrecognizable, before shattering into a barrage of razor-like fragments that hurtled toward the silhouette. Instinctively they generated a burst of spatial distortion, bending the incoming shards around their body, sending them spiraling into the void, where they dissolved into motes of evaporating data. But the column being was relentless, its ribbons converged from every direction, fusing back into a massive form that descended from above like a collapsing star, its presence blotting out every beam of light in the corridor. The silhouette hurled themselves forward, diving into a narrow fissure that cracked open in mid-air to reveal a tunnel of swirling cobalt energy, and as they entered, the tunnel constricted like a living throat swallowing them whole, compressing space until the silhouette could barely breathe. A blinding pulse erupted at the tunnel's end, pulling them into a spherical arena suspended in the emptiness, its outer walls a swirling mixture of luminous storms and black voids, as if creation and annihilation were trapped in perpetual negotiation. The arena floor materialized beneath them, composed of fractal patterns in constant metamorphosis, and as the silhouettes steadied themselves, the column being forced its way through the tunnel, its body stretching, distorting, condensing until it burst into the arena with a shockwave that sent fractures racing across the fractal ground. The arena's walls tightened, storms intensifying, lightning striking in arcs of white-blue fury, and the silhouette realized this was no longer a chase, this was an execution chamber created by the Convergence itself. The entity roared, and the arena started collapsing inward, leaving the silhouette no choice but to gather every fragment of remaining energy and charge headlong into the heart of the collapsing dimensional storm. The silhouette launched themselves into the heart of the collapsing dimensional storm just as the fractal arena's walls folded inward like colossal jaws, and the moment their form breached the cyclone's spinning core, the world inverted into a spiraling tunnel of stuttering realities, each flickering past like malfunctioning film frames stitched together by an unstable cosmic editor struggling to keep the universe coherent. The storm's pressure intensified with a crushing density, pulling at every particle of their being, distorting their outline until it rippled like liquid shadow. Behind them, the negative space entity tore free from the ruptured arena, its body unraveling into tendrils that reached into the tunnel, claws of absence stretching forward with impossible speed, dragging streaks of darkness across the swirling walls as it closed the distance. The tunnel shifted tone, its inner surfaces pulsing like a massive artery as colossal rings of energy spun in alternating directions, grinding together with a sound like thunder reversed in time. The silhouette sprinted along an emerging bridge of solidified energy that formed underfoot only moments before dissolving, each step carrying them past alternate versions of the collapsing arena, some still intact, some imploding, some frozen as if time had halted entirely. Suddenly the storm shuddered, releasing a shockwave that splintered the tunnel into branching pathways, each twisting through a different timeline. The silhouette had no choice but to leap instinctively into the nearest fracture, crashing onto a floating shard of obsidian suspended within an endless void filled with drifting remnants of shattered realities. The shard spun rapidly, sending them rolling toward its jagged edge, but before they fell, the void around them rippled as the negative space entity reassembled in midair, its form now towering, its limbs multiplied, each one stretching into razor-sharp tendrils that cut through distant floating debris like knives slicing through fabric. The silhouette steadied themselves, bending the space around the obsidian shard to slow its rotation, but the entity lunged, striking with enough force to split the shard in two. Fragments spiraled outward, each reflecting distorted images of possible futures before dissolving into luminous ash. With no solid ground remaining, the silhouette propelled themselves upward using a burst of kinetic distortion, landing on a newly manifested platform of translucent gold that hummed with harmonic resonance. The platform vibrated at a frequency that resonated with the silhouette's core, stabilizing their fragmented form temporarily. However, the negative space entity warped into existence directly above them, compressing entire constellations of darkness into a single strike. The silhouette raised their arm, generating a shield of refracted dimensional energy, but the impact was so tremendous it shattered the platform and launched both combatants through a rupture in the void. They were ejected into a colossal chamber filled with rotating planetary fragments, each suspended within gravitational fields that interacted like a complex three-dimensional puzzle. Lightning-like arcs of dimensional static connected the fragments, forming a lattice that shifted unpredictably. Any misstep would mean being crushed between colliding celestial masses. The silhouette landed on the surface of a fractured moon-like slab, their form barely stabilizing before the negative space entity detonated into a wave of distortions that warped gravity itself, causing the slab to twist violently. The silhouette leapt across drifting fragments, momentum carrying them through narrow gaps as the entire chamber destabilized, gravitational lines snapping like broken strings. A massive planetary core drifted into their path, pulsing with molten energy, forcing the silhouette to bend space itself to slip around its burning surface. The entity reformed behind them, now absorbing fragments of the chamber, growing denser, heavier, more catastrophic with each passing moment. Realizing the chamber would not remain stable long enough for a prolonged fight, the silhouette surged forward, diving between two colliding masses that smashed together with the force of a dying star, triggering a shockwave that blew open a fissure in the chamber's outer boundary. The silhouette hurled themselves through the breach, tumbling into open void, only to find themselves suspended before a colossal horizon of swirling energy, the Convergence Maw. A gravitational singularity that appeared less like a black hole and more like an incomprehensible decision point where timelines nodded, merged, or died. The maw pulsed with an ancient, rhythmic thrum that resonated through every atom of existence. Behind them, the negative space entity emerged, its form now colossal enough to eclipse distant stars, its attention fixed entirely on the silhouette. The maw dragged at both of them, pulling with irresistible force, its gravitational tendrils curling around reality. With nowhere left to run, the silhouettes steadied themselves against the pull, recognizing that the next moment would determine not just survival but the trajectory of every timeline tied to their existence. The silhouette braced against the Convergence Maw's tidal pull as the gravitational tendrils tightened their invisible grip, dragging at every fiber of their existence while the negative space entity, now swollen to a monstrous scale, advanced with a predatory slowness, savoring the inevitability of the impending collapse. The cosmic horizon behind them churned in spiraling layers, each spinning at a different temporal velocity, so that distant fragments of timelines bled into one another like smeared reflections on a shattered mirror. The silhouette attempted to widen the dimensional buffer around their form, but the maw's singularity gnawed through any barrier they erected, unraveling each field of force as though consuming strands of thread. The vacuum between them vibrated with pressure fluctuations, generating a low-frequency rumble that resonated through the bones of every reality. The entity lunged first, a sweeping arc of compressed absence that tore open the space between them, leaving a jagged wound in the void that crackled with inverted lightning. The silhouette twisted aside, feeling the strike shear across their outline, destabilizing the edges of their silhouette and momentarily scattering them like drifting smoke. Regaining form, they countered with a surge of refracted dimensional energy that bent the gravitational pull long enough to dart onto a shard of frozen space-time drifting past like a broken tile in an infinite mosaic. The shard buckled under the Maw's pull, fracturing into crystalline splinters that spiraled outward in glittering arcs before dissolving. The entity materialized again ahead of the silhouette, its massive frame blotting out the Maw's brilliance, its limbs splitting into tendrils that lashed outward with venomous precision. Each tendril sliced through gravity itself, leaving curved trails that distorted perspective as though painting fractures onto the void. The silhouette sprinted across collapsing platforms of temporal residue that formed only to disintegrate underfoot, leaping between them as the Maw pulled harder, tugging at their center of mass until every movement felt weighted with crushing inertia. With a violent shift, the Maw collapsed inward before expanding outward like a heartbeat, sending a concussion wave that flung both combatants into a spiraling rotation. The silhouette spun uncontrollably, catching glimpses of alternate versions of themselves flickering at the edges of vision, some reaching out, some in mid-battle, some fading, echoes of timelines collapsing into the singularity's hunger. Clawing through the distortion, the silhouette seized control of their rotation, firing a burst of spatial compression downward to arrest their tumble and land on a newly manifested ring of gravimetric energy encircling the Maw like a planetary orbit. The ring vibrated with ancient harmonic frequencies, each note destabilizing the negative space entity's form, causing it to pulse erratically as it reconstituted itself. Sensing opportunity, the silhouette extended both arms, channeling the resonance of the ring into a focused harmonic beam that struck the entity's core. For the first time, the entity recoiled violently, its form collapsing inward before bursting outward with a shockwave of inverted color that washed across the ring and shattered it into cascading ribbons of broken dimensional light. The silhouette plunged with the debris, twisting through falling arcs of luminous fragments until they landed on the sloping surface of an enormous gravitational shell drifting near the Maw. The shell's curvature bent vision itself. Distant stars seemed to slide across its surface like reflections in a warped mirror. The negative space entity hit the shell moments later, creating a crater-like depression that sent ripples across the structure, each ripple altering the pull of gravity so drastically that the silhouette staggered, nearly being pulled sideways into the singularity. The entity rose, its form now vibrating chaotically as the harmonic damage continued to destabilize it. Its core pulsed like a dying star, flickering with fragmented layers of spatial corruption. Desperate, it extended a colossal arm that stretched across the shell, attempting to pin the silhouette in place before the Maw claimed them both. The silhouette retaliated with a collapse surge technique, compressing a pocket of space around their arm before detonating it outward, generating a shock pulse that knocked the entity back and carved a gash through the shell's surface. The Maw seized the moment to pull with horrifying force, dragging entire sections of the shell inward like molten metal flowing toward a drain. The silhouette was caught in the pull, sliding helplessly toward the growing vortex, shards of dimensional debris rushing past them like meteor streaks. Summoning every remaining reserve, they anchored themselves by driving a spike of condensed space-time into the shell, but the spike fractured almost instantly under the Maw's pressure. The entity, half collapsing, half reforming, lunged with a final, desperate attack, its destabilized limbs flailing with unpredictable trajectories as pieces of its body peeled away into the singularity. The silhouette had only seconds left, either devise a final countermeasure or be swallowed by the Maw along with the entity and the final threads of countless collapsing timelines. The silhouette clung to the disintegrating shell as the Convergence Maw's gravity intensified, dragging entire bands of collapsing timelines inward with a thunderous, subharmonic roar that vibrated through the void like the death knell of a universe. Their grip slipped as the shell fractured beneath them, molten threads of dimensional residue sliding away into the singularity like liquefied glass pulled into a drain. The negative space entity lunged again, its destabilizing limbs whipping outward in desperate convulsions, each movement carving fresh distortions across the battlefield. Layers of space buckled and folded, collapsing into origami-like shapes before unraveling into swirling storm bands around the Maw. The silhouette pushed off the last remaining fragment of the shell as it crumbled completely, launching into a spiraling ascent through debris that flickered between states of matter, light, and pure temporal echo. The Maw's pull chased them, dragging at their limbs with invisible claws, slowing every motion as though time itself grew viscous, binding them in an ever-thickening tar of gravitational oppression. The negative space entity materialized above them again in a sudden, jarring blur, its form now so unstable that chunks of its body peeled away mid-lunge and were immediately devoured by the Maw. Yet the entity persisted, driven by some final instinct to destroy the silhouette before the singularity claimed them both. It swung a titanic arm of fractured void material, the blow trailing arcs of corrosive static that dissolved through space like acid eating through fabric. The silhouette twisted midair, barely clearing the attack, feeling the static burn across their silhouette like a hot coil pressed against smoke. They retaliated with a burst of spatial inversion, forcing the surrounding gravity to flip momentarily. The sudden shift hurled the entity upward like a stone shot from a slingshot, sending it spinning uncontrollably into a band of warped starlight where it collided with the twisted reflections of collapsing timelines. The silhouettes of alternate selves appeared again, some thriving, some fighting, some dissolving, each flicker hinting at futures that may never exist if the Maw consumed everything. The silhouette used the distraction to gain altitude, stabilizing their form enough to channel the last reserves of harmonic resonance into a concentrated sphere spinning between their hands. The sphere pulsed violently, emitting rapid tremors that fractured nearby debris into spiraling shards. They hurled it downward with every ounce of remaining force. The harmonic sphere streaked through the void like a comet, slamming directly into the entity's core. For a moment, everything froze. The entity's body spasmed, its limbs locking into a rigid lattice of collapsing geometry before exploding outward in a violent burst of inverted energy that flattened the surrounding space. Shockwaves rippled across the cosmos, each wave bending stars, twisting nebulae into spirals, and sending gravitational bloom rings expanding in every direction. But the Maw absorbed most of the blast instantly, pulling the explosion inward like inhaling smoke. The recoil hurled the silhouette backward, sending them tumbling through a tunnel of collapsing dimensions as the Maw's pull intensified to catastrophic levels. Entire fragments of realities tore loose, shattered cities, broken sky layers, cracked cosmic structures, and spiraled past the silhouette like debris sucked into a black hurricane. The silhouette attempted to stabilize themselves, but the gravity surged again, crushing inward with terrifying force. Their limbs elongated and compressed in rapid oscillations as the singularity's field attempted to stretch them across multiple planes simultaneously. They fought the pull with desperate bursts of compression energy, each pulse slowing their descent by the smallest fraction, but the Maw was too strong, its hunger increasing exponentially with each passing second. The negative space entity reformed below them, despite its near-complete destruction, as a skeletal, trembling ruin, dragging itself upward with twitching limbs, still intent on finishing the battle even as the Maw devoured its remaining essence. Its core flickered like a dying ember, sputtering bursts of corrupted light that warped the spatial lattice around it. With a final surge, it threw itself at the silhouette, its movements frantic, feral, no longer strategic but purely driven by annihilation instinct. The silhouette braced for impact, unable to maneuver quickly enough under the Maw's grip. Time warped, stretching the moment into a long, drawn-out distortion, until at last the entity's ruined form collided with them. The force of the collision ruptured the space around them, tearing open a jagged fissure in the temporal fabric. Both figures tumbled into the rift, battered by the Maw's gravitational shockwaves as they fell through a spiraling cascade of collapsing realities. A roar thundered through the void, not physical, not sonic, but the raw vibration of the universe buckling under the Maw's expanding event horizon. The Maw pulsed once, then expanded again, its horizon swelling outward, chasing them through the collapsing fissure as though the singularity itself had chosen to pursue them beyond its own boundary. The silhouette felt the trembling of reality's structural beams snapping one by one as the Maw surged after them, ready to consume whatever sanctuary the rift might offer. Lina felt the suspended hush fracture as a trembling pulse rippled through the void, the darkness around her contracting into a thin vortex of ember-colored threads pulling her upward as if her very thoughts were being reeled in. Disoriented, she reached out into the weightless gulf only to touch a cold prismatic surface that mirrored her outline in warped fragments, each reflection whispering half-formed echoes of her name. Suddenly the spiraling ascent inverted, slamming her awareness downward into a corridor of flickering white grids where time twisted like a ribbon, every step forward replaying itself in reverse, forcing her to push through overlapping moments that clung to her skin like static. She sensed the hidden observer again, a distant rhythmic thrum watching from beyond the geometry, its presence now heavier, almost impatient. Light shard bursts ignited along the corridor, illuminating the silhouettes of countless doorways, each door vibrating with a different memory not yet lived, not yet chosen. A violent tremor cracked the grid beneath her feet, sending a shockwave of fractured reality rippling outward as if a colossal engine beneath her had restarted after centuries of stillness. The engine's roar became a low, tectonic growl, metallic, resonant, ancient, swallowing the silence as gravity abruptly returned, pulling her sideways into a spiraling chamber of rotating rings carved with symbols that shifted whenever she blinked. The rings accelerated, blurring into concentric halos of molten gold and shadow, and Lina realized they were locking into alignment around her, forming a cage, or a threshold. The unseen observer's pulse surged again, this time so close she could feel its breathless pressure against her back, urging her to step into the threshold before the ring sealed. She pushed forward, the air thick and electric, and as her hand crossed the boundary, an eruption of blinding white erupted from the chamber's core, tearing open a passage of cascading light that stretched infinitely in every direction. Beneath the roar, she heard a single unmistakable chime, the same sound that marked her first glitch, and her chest tightened as a new voice whispered through the static, "Vector unmasked. Entry permitted." The chamber lunged forward, hurling her into the radiant fissure at impossible speed, every particle of light slicing past her like ribbons of coated fire. The fissure coalesced into a colossal circular horizon, rotating slowly, revealing an impossible structure suspended in the void, an inverted citadel of glass and latticework, its vast architecture breathing like a living organism. Time wavered again, and the citadel's lower spires unfurled like wings, exposing a spiraling ramp descending into a storm of black vapor. Lina's momentum slowed just long enough for her to witness a dark humanoid shape, featureless and towering, emerge at the citadel's threshold, lifting its head as though it had been waiting for her arrival. The moment their unseen gazes met, the vortex behind her collapsed with a snap, severing her escape as the entire structure ignited with trembling blue sigils. The figure raised an arm, and with a voice that resonated through bone and air alike, it spoke a single command that boomed across the void: "Proceed." The command struck her like a current, and the floor beneath her crystallized into existence, locking her in place as the citadel's gates began to open. The last echo of the collapsing vortex faded, leaving her suspended between choice and inevitability as the gargantuan gates revealed a blinding core of shifting stars, something awakening behind them, something waiting intimately for her name. The blinding core of shifting stars pulsed before Lina as the citadel's colossal gates continued to unfurl with a grinding resonance that vibrated through her bones, each widening segment revealing deeper layers of impossible architecture made of spiraling glass veins, fluid metallic conduits, and vast tessellations that folded into and out of themselves like breathing lungs. The unseen force that had locked her in place finally released, allowing her to step forward. Though the floor beneath her still trembled with an ancient, awakening energy, the air shimmered as if heated, though no warmth reached her skin, and when she crossed the threshold the entire chamber responded, rings of faint blue symbols rising from the walls like bioluminescent dust, pulled upward by her mere presence. She felt them brush against her shoulders, dissolving into a prickling current that raced through her nerves, synchronizing with her pulse in an unsettling rhythm. Ahead, the featureless dark figure that had commanded her to proceed drifted backward into the starlit expanse, its edges blurring as though it were woven from mist and shattered light. As Lina advanced, the ground beneath her rippled, mosaic pieces reconfiguring into new patterns with every step, some forming pathways, some forming fragmented images of scenes she couldn't fully grasp, silhouettes fleeing through shadowy corridors, spirals collapsing into black voids, and a radiant sphere shattering into countless shards that scattered into the surrounding grid of stars. A sudden vibration rolled through the citadel, deep and seismic, causing the upper spires to contract and expand like vast metallic ribs, exhaling a torrent of shimmering particles that cascaded downward like falling ashes of light. The particles swirled around her, forming a translucent stream that surged past her ankles and flowed toward the heart of the citadel, as if guiding her deeper inside. The dark humanoid shape halted at a towering archway composed of intertwining beams of silver, gold, and pure shadow, each strand humming with distinct frequencies that converged into a low harmonic drone. The archway responded to her presence, its inner surface liquefying into a mirror-like membrane that rippled with every breath she took, revealing brief glimpses of her own silhouette distorted through layers of time, one version reaching forward, another stepping back, and yet another collapsing to the floor as if overwhelmed. Panic flickered in her chest, but the drone emanating from the archway grew warmer, almost serene, coaxing her closer. Suddenly a pulse detonated from the citadel's core, sending concentric waves of prismatic light through the chamber, and the dark figure bowed its head as though acknowledging an unseen command. The membrane at the archway's center split open with a silent tear, unveiling a spiraling descent of interconnected platforms suspended above a churning storm of radiant fog. Each platform rotated slowly, emitting coated beams that scanned the air, reacting to something embedded within her, the unknown vector the voice had recognized earlier. She felt it again now, glowing faintly in her sternum like a dormant signal reawakening, and the platforms responded instantly, shifting their alignment to form a direct path toward the core. The dark figure raised its arm once more, pointing toward the descending platforms before dissolving into a cascade of ink-black particles that fled upward into the Citadel's highest chambers. Lina inhaled sharply, stepping onto the first platform, feeling it vibrate under her weight before launching forward with impossible speed, carrying her deeper into the glowing storm. Windless motion warped the space around her, the stars spiraling into elongated streaks, and the further she traveled, the louder the Citadel's heartbeat became. Steady, massive, alive, her platform suddenly halted above a vast hollow chamber, the fog below parting to reveal a monumental sphere of crystallized light suspended by thousands of threads made of pure luminescence, each thread pulsing in time with the heartbeat. The sphere cracked with a resonant boom, just slightly, releasing a single beam of concentrated white fire that shot upward past her and illuminated an uncountable network of shadowed structures far above. A voice, different from the last, softer yet ancient, whispered from within the cracking sphere, vibrating through her entire body with haunting clarity. Awakening incomplete. Vector bearer, prepare for convergence. Lina froze, feeling every instinct scream with both fear and magnetic pull as the chamber darkened around her and the sphere's cracks expanded, flooding the air with threads of blinding light that reached for her like searching fingers. The reaching threads of light curled toward Lina with impossible precision, their crystalline filaments trembling as though sensing the rhythm of her breath, and as they neared her skin they shifted hue, from blinding white to a soft, iridescent glow, before latching onto the invisible point pulsing within her chest, the same hidden vector that had awakened the platforms. Instantly the entire chamber convulsed with a deep tectonic roar, the suspended sphere splitting further along its glowing fault lines as torrents of radiant fog surged upward in colossal spirals that wrapped around the floating platforms like slow-motion storms frozen in crystalline arcs. Lina's balance wavered as her platform tilted, momentarily dipping toward the blinding abyss below, and she felt a jolt of vertigo as thousands of luminescent threads beneath the fog shifted like colossal nerves firing in response to her presence. Suddenly, a resonant heartbeat thundered through the air, a single, massive pulse that caused every luminous thread in the chamber to flare upward in synchronized brilliance, momentarily revealing the silhouettes of titanic structures hidden in the distant gloom, like cathedral spires forged from starlight and shadow. The ancient voice within the cracking sphere spoke again, louder now yet still carrying a haunting softness that brushed against her thoughts like a whisper from behind her ear. Vector bearer identified. Alignment sequence commencing. The suspended sphere vibrated, shedding layers of radiant dust that drifted outward in concentric rings toward her platform, each ring striking her with a faint static ripple that made her muscles twitch involuntarily. The invisible point within her chest began to throb harder, as though answering some call from deep within the sphere, and she felt an overwhelming pull, magnetic, consuming, dragging her closer toward the fractured core. The platform beneath her lurched forward, accelerating along a spiral path that formed spontaneously from threads of forming light, and as she descended toward the core the fog broke apart into vortexes that parted before her like enormous, swirling gates. The moment she reached the final precipice, the sphere's largest crack split fully open with a silent burst of white fire, revealing within it a roiling sea of fragmented memories, half-silhouettes of figures she couldn't recognize, and fractures of entire worlds collapsing inward on themselves. Shards of time and light whirled around her, pulling at her outline, trying to superimpose past and future versions of her onto her physical form, until her body felt stretched across endless, overlapping moments. She screamed, though no sound escaped her throat, and the chamber responded by dimming into a deep, cosmic twilight that shut out the collapsing visions, isolating her in a single beam of pale blue light. The voice returned once more, now echoing from every direction, layered and harmonic as if thousands of unseen beings were speaking the same words through the same ancient memory. Convergence threshold reached. Prepare for imprint. The platform shuddered violently as an enormous mechanical luminal construct unfolded beneath the sphere, forming a vast circular array of rotating glyphs that aligned themselves with her position. Each glyph fired a spear of thin radiance upward, the beams weaving together above her into a spiraling lattice that tightened like a cage around her silhouette, sealing her in a column of blinding geometry. The air became electric, vibrating so intensely that her teeth felt like they were ringing inside her skull, and she felt her consciousness pull sideways, as if some unseen hand were reaching inside her mind to locate a long-buried key. The light intensified until she saw nothing but white, until even the Citadel's heartbeat faded into silence, and then, abruptly, the lattice snapped inward with a sound like a star collapsing, punching a surge of energy directly through her chest and detonating outward in a shockwave so powerful it obliterated every trace of fog in the chamber, revealing the full monstrous scale of the architecture around her. As the shockwave expanded, something within the core responded, a second voice, sharper, colder, and far more aware, whispering a single line that froze her blood. Vector bearer. Anomaly confirmed. The chamber trembled, the sphere cracked in a violent cascade of cascading fractures, and the light pouring from within shifted from serene white into a predatory, volatile blue as the entire Citadel began reconfiguring its shape around her. The Citadel's colossal reconfiguration deepened into a violent, tectonic shudder as the sphere's fractures multiplied like luminous veins crawling across a dying star, each crack releasing another surge of volatile blue radiance that spiraled upward and forced the suspended platforms to shift into new angular formations around Lina. The air grew dense, charged with an almost gravitational pressure that pressed against her ribcage and made every breath feel like inhaling molten light, while the invisible vector inside her pulsed harder, syncing with the erratic rhythm of the Citadel itself as though some internal compass was being forcibly recalibrated. Beneath her, the rotating glyph array accelerated until its symbols blurred into a singular ring of incandescent motion, casting violent strobe-like shadows across the vast chamber and revealing brief glimpses of impossible architecture. Colossal arches twisting into recursive loops, floating corridors that folded in on themselves, and distant altars suspended over glowing abysses that stretched beyond any visible boundary. Suddenly the cold second voice, the one that had branded her an anomaly, rippled through the chamber again, sharper now, almost irritated. Reconfiguration incomplete. Anomaly persists. Initiate override. The moment the final word echoed, the entire lattice of rotating glyphs beneath Lina exploded upward into dozens of segmented beams that wrapped around her like metallic serpents made of pure light, constricting and rotating with surgical precision, forcing her arms outward and her body into a suspended cruciform silhouette. She gasped as a wave of energy surged through her spine, fracturing her thoughts into scattered flashes, faint reflections of cities she had never visited, names she didn't recognize, and fragmented glimpses of a shadowed figure reaching toward her from some unreachable past. The chamber dimmed again, but this time only around her, isolating her inside a narrow funnel of shifting luminescence like an execution spotlight forged from stardust. Then the soft ancient voice, the first one, the one that had tried to guide her, echoed weakly from the cracking sphere, override unauthorized. Vector bearer remains required. Imprint sequence cannot be aborted. Instantly the cold voice countered, its tone now edged with something akin to fury. Error. Conflict in directive hierarchy. Initiate Adjudication Protocol. With those words the chamber responded violently as massive segments of the architecture detached themselves from the far walls and rotated inward, forming an immense triple ring construct above Lina, each ring spinning in a different direction and carved with towering, shifting symbols that glowed with alternating pulses of gold and deep blue. Those rings descended slowly, aligning vertically with Lina's suspended form, and once they locked into place the space between them filled with dense, liquid light that congealed into swirling layers of translucent geometry that tried to map her entire outline. The mapping energy brushed against her skin, scanning her with such intense detail that she could feel her heartbeat echo inside the light. Suddenly the rings transitioned from scanning to judgment. The light hardened, shifting into a cold, blade-like radiance that lashed outward in dissecting sweeps, carving through the air mere centimeters away from her suspended silhouette as though preparing to erase her from existence. She felt the cold voice loom closer, its presence tightening around her as if the chamber itself were closing a fist. Vector unstable. Probability of systemic collapse, 87%. Removal is optimal. Her pulse spiked, panic erupting through her veins, but before she could scream the ancient voice flared inside her skull with a resonance so powerful it nearly knocked her unconscious. Do not fear. Your vector has not yet revealed its full origin. At that last word the platform beneath her erupted with blinding light, the glyphs forming a spiral that shot upward through her body and into the rings above, shattering the blade like radiance and sending shockwaves that cracked the triple ring construct. The cold voice roared, an actual roar this time, as the chamber pitched violently sideways, platforms crashing into one another, the fractured sphere above her splitting into a flood of swirling shards. Lina felt her restraints shatter as the vector inside her surged with a force that felt alive, intelligent, and utterly uncontainable. As she fell forward into the storm of light and debris, one final whisper from the ancient voice reached her. Your arrival was not an anomaly. It was the first step of release. The corridor's collapsing lights flickered behind him as he pushed deeper into the subterranean archive, every step echoing like a countdown against the tightening pressure in the air, and he felt the strange vibration crawling up the metal walls as if the entire facility were awakening. His breath steadied as he descended the final staircase into the core chamber where the obsidian monolith pulsed with a faint inner glow, and though the glyphs on its surface had been dormant for centuries, They now rippled with a fiery rhythm synchronized with the resonant hum vibrating in his bones, compelling him forward even as the heat rising from the floor warned him he had only moments before the chamber sealed entirely, so he forced himself onward, reaching toward the shimmering fracture at the monolith's center where a sliver of white-gold light spiraled outward like liquid thread, and as he stretched his hand toward it, the air warped, the temperature plunging so rapidly that frost bloomed across the metal railing beside him, but he did not hesitate, pressing his palm against the monolith as the fracture tore open with a deafening rush, enveloping him in a tidal wave of memories not his own. Battles fought in crimson storms, cities drifting above oceans of glass, a million nameless figures collapsing under skies choked with shadow, and through it all, a voice echoing from a place beyond time, neither human nor machine, whispering that the threshold required a witness who carried both truth and ruin within him, and he realized with a sharp, breathless jolt that the voice was directing him toward a future catastrophe already set in motion. A convergence where the constructs hunting him would collapse into something far more devastating unless he severed the connection they sought to exploit. So he pushed deeper into the stream of visions, forcing himself to sift through the overlapping images until he found the single thread that pulsed brighter than the rest, an anchor leading to the origin point, a hidden chamber that resembled the current one yet larger, colder, filled with suspended figures encased in transparent shells, their forms obscured but their presence unmistakably linked to the monolith itself. And as he reached toward that vision, a razor-sharp tremor tore through the chamber around him, forcing him back into his own body as the monolith's glow surged to a blinding intensity, the floor cracking beneath his feet, shards of stone erupting upward while a vortex of dust spiraled around him, and he staggered backward as the fracture sealed itself with a thunderous snap, plunging the chamber into near total darkness except for the lingering afterimage seared into his sight, and in that fading silhouette he understood the horrifying implication. The monolith had shown him not what was possible, but what was inevitable unless he intervened, and as the emergency lights sputtered to life overhead, he turned toward the exit only to hear the unmistakable metallic footfalls of an approaching unit echoing down the tunnel, their rhythmic pattern too precise to be anything but one of the advanced constructs that had tracked him since the beginning, and though exhaustion threatened to pull him to the floor, he forced his legs to move, pressing himself against the cold wall just as the silhouette of the construct emerged, a towering shape of shadows and gleaming edges, its sensors sweeping the room with a crimson glow, searching for the slightest hint of movement, and he held his breath as the red beam traced along the shattered floor, passing inches from his boot before sliding away, and for one agonizing moment he believed he might slip past it, but then the fractured monolith behind him released a final, dying pulse that illuminated his outline just long enough for the construct to shift its head sharply, locking onto him with a mechanical snarl as it surged forward, and with no time to think he sprinted toward the secondary tunnel, its collapsing ceiling showering sparks as the construct's heavy footsteps thundered after him. And as he vaulted over a broken pipe and slid into the narrowing passageway, he felt the searing heat of an energy blast scorch the stone beside his shoulder, propelling him onward into the tightening darkness where he knew the only path forward was the one the monolith had carved into his mind, a path that demanded sacrifice, clarity, and the willingness to face the truth waiting at the origin point. The air around them seemed to thicken into a viscous, humming pressure that clung to their skin like a second atmosphere, and as the colossal silhouette leaned down with a slow, almost reluctant descent, its luminous strands rippling through the darkness in hypnotic spirals, the protagonist felt a tremor of recognition surge through their chest. Not an emotional memory but a deep, non-verbal echo, something older than thought, whispering that this encounter was not an accident nor an anomaly, but the inevitable convergence of countless unseen decisions guiding them through every corridor, every collapse, every haunting shadow that had preceded this moment. The reservoir convulsed beneath the entity, sending soft waves across the reflective surface until distorted fragments of the protagonist's own outline shimmered toward them like ghostly doubles, each reflection slightly out of sync, lagging or advancing by fractions of a second as though trapped in different layers of time. The entity's tendrils extended, not to restrain but to explore, brushing the air in slow arcs that emitted faint glimmers like bioluminescent dust, and when one tendril drifted within inches of the protagonist's shoulder, the entire chamber vibrated with a resonant pulse that caused overhead drones to jolt violently, their dormant lights snapping awake in chaotic spirals. Startled but unwilling to retreat, the protagonists steadied themselves as the drone reflections in the reservoir began to separate again, behaving with eerie independence, some rising higher, some sinking into the liquid without disturbing its surface, creating an impossible tableau that defied every physical expectation. Without warning, The ceiling lights overhead sputtered to life for a heartbeat before exploding in a shower of sparks that rained down with sharp metallic pops, plunging the entire hall into a darkness broken only by the pale blue glow emanating from the entity and a faint, pulsating strip of light illuminating a previously unseen tunnel on the far side of the platform. The entity's mass shifted suddenly, towering higher, its form expanding outward like a blooming shadow as it directed its focus toward the tunnel. And the protagonist felt a surge of energy ripple through them, a subtle but undeniable sense of direction, as though the entity itself demanded that they proceed. The floor beneath them trembled, a low grinding rumble rising from deep within the structure, and cracks began to spiderweb across the platform, glowing faintly at the edges as though filled with dormant circuitry awakening under stress. Realizing the chamber was destabilizing, the protagonist turned toward the illuminated tunnel. But as they began to move, the shadow of the entity fell across their path, not blocking them but accompanying them, a vast moving silhouette stretching across the walls like a guardian spirit. The moment they stepped into the narrow tunnel, the oppressive hum shifted, becoming thinner, sharper, almost like a chorus of distant metallic voices filtering through overlapping vents. The tunnel sloped upward, walls lined with rusted machinery leaking faint wisps of vapor that moved as if aware of the protagonist's passing, curling away from them in slow, serpentine trails. The deeper they climbed, the more the architecture changed, from industrial metal to sleek, unfamiliar alloy etched with patterns resembling the neural network design seen in the circular chamber. The air grew colder, carrying with it a scent of ozone and something faintly floral, impossibly out of place in the subterranean labyrinth. The path eventually opened into a wide observation deck overlooking a cavern filled with massive suspended structures, geometric monoliths floating in perfect stillness, rotating slowly in synchronized patterns like pieces of an enormous puzzle waiting to be assembled. At the center of this cavern, an immense cylindrical construct emitted a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the protagonist's bones, and with each rotation of the monoliths, a cascade of ghostly afterimages flickered across their surfaces as though recording and erasing time simultaneously. Drawn forward by a sense of foreboding purpose, the protagonist approached the safety railing only for the deck to shudder violently, lights flickering as a sudden surge of power erupted through the cavern, causing the monoliths to accelerate until they spun with unstable speed, their edges dissolving into streaks of shifting light. A single tier opened in the air above the cylindrical construct, a vertical fissure of shimmering distortion, as though reality itself had been sliced open, exposing a void of swirling darkness threaded with glimmers of impossible color. The protagonist staggered back, overwhelmed by the sheer gravitational pull of the fissure, but before they could retreat fully, a familiar presence flickered at the corner of their vision. A featureless dark silhouette standing at the far edge of the deck, watching silently, its form glitching between frames again. This time, however, the silhouette did not point or gesture. Instead, it merely waited, as if anticipating the protagonist's next decision. The deck groaned under increasing stress, railings trembling, distant alarms beginning to echo from unknown depths, and the fissure widened slowly, emitting a growing, rhythmic pulse that matched the spectral heartbeat of the reservoir entity now far behind them. Caught between collapsing structures, a looming dimensional rupture, and the silent witness of the silhouette, the protagonist realized with chilling certainty that the choices ahead would not only determine their survival, but the fate of whatever forces had orchestrated their path from the very beginning. The cavern trembled again as the protagonist stood frozen between the shuddering railing and the expanding dimensional fissure, the silent featureless silhouette watching from across the deck with an unreadable stillness that made the air feel even heavier. And as the monoliths accelerated further, their rotations becoming erratic spirals of light that fractured into thin spectral ribbons, the protagonist felt the vibration beneath their feet shift from a mechanical thrum to something more organic, as though the entire construct around them had begun to breathe in slow, ragged intervals. The fissure above the cylindrical structure widened with a sudden rippling distortion, sending a downward draft through the cavern that pulled dust, stray cables, and flickering motes of light toward it in spiraling currents, and for a moment the protagonist feared they would be lifted off the unstable deck entirely, but the suction wavered unexpectedly, like a heartbeat faltering mid-pulse. Taking advantage of that brief reprieve, the protagonist moved along the trembling platform toward an auxiliary walkway branching to the left, a narrow metal bridge suspended by cables that groaned under the strain of the cavern's escalating instability. As they stepped onto the bridge, the silhouette on the far side shifted slightly, its outline flickering as if buffering between dimensions, and for the first time it moved, not forward, but sideways, drifting into a position directly adjacent to the fissure's path as though aligning itself with the anomaly's expanding influence. The protagonist's pulse quickened as they realized the silhouette wasn't simply observing, it was positioning itself as though anticipating a change, a convergence, or a collapse. Halfway across the bridge, a deafening crack split the cavern as one of the floating monoliths collided with another, sending a shockwave through the air that shattered several supporting beams and caused the walkway to swing violently. The protagonist dropped to one knee, gripping the railing as sparks shot from severed cables above, showering the bridge in a rain of sizzling fragments. The cylindrical construct at the cavern's center pulsed in quick successive bursts, and each pulse caused the fissure to flare brighter, exposing for a split instant the churning depths inside, an abyss layered with spirals of shifting geometry and distant glimmers that looked like cities or memories or something alive. Determined to reach stable ground before the entire structure collapsed, the protagonist forced themselves upright and continued across the wildly swaying bridge, each step matching the rhythm of the cylindrical pulses that seemed to draw them forward with magnetic precision. Upon reaching the opposite platform, they found themselves standing near a towering archway built from the same alloy as the neural-etched walls below. But this structure hummed with an unmistakably different energy, its surfaces rippling with faint holographic projections that cycled through unfamiliar symbols and branching pathways like a living schematic. The silhouette, still maintaining its position near the fissure, flickered again, and this time its form briefly duplicated, two overlapping silhouettes appearing for a fraction of a second before snapping back into a single figure, suggesting a distortion in time rather than space. The protagonist approached the archway cautiously, sensing that whatever mechanism powered it was reacting to their presence, for the projections began to stabilize into a coherent pattern, a pathway leading upward through what appeared to be a spire-like structure, with annotations highlighting several critical junctions, one of which pulsed at the exact same rhythm as the cylindrical construct below. As they leaned closer, trying to trace the pattern's meaning, the floor beneath the archway vibrated sharply and the holographic projection flared outward, forming a thin, translucent barrier that enveloped the protagonist in a cocoon of shimmering light. Instantly the roar of the collapsing cavern diminished to a distant murmur, as though the barrier had separated them from the surrounding chaos. Through the shimmering membrane they could still see the monoliths spinning wildly, now shedding fragments of themselves like shards of burning glass, and the fissure widening into a crack large enough to warp the cavern's perspective, bending the distant structures into impossible angles as if gravity itself were being rewritten. The silhouette turned its head, or at least seemed to, toward the protagonist, even though it had no features to convey expression, and it lifted one arm in a slow, deliberate motion, extending it toward the fissure as though offering something unseen or acknowledging a step that could not be undone. The barrier around the protagonist began to contract, pulling them gently but irresistibly toward the archway, and the deck beneath the arch split open along glowing seams as a spiral staircase of shimmering alloy unfolded downward like the opening petals of an inorganic flower. With the cavern collapsing behind them and the fissure threatening to consume everything, the protagonist allowed the barrier to guide them toward the newly revealed descent, sensing that whatever awaited below was intertwined not only with the anomaly, but with the truth behind the silhouette, the entity, and the orchestrated path that had brought them to the brink of unraveling worlds. As the protagonist descended the shimmering alloy staircase spiraling beneath the archway, the contracting barrier that guided them pulsed with a rhythm that matched the fading echoes of the collapsing cavern above, and each pulse illuminated the walls of the hidden shaft in fleeting waves that revealed inscriptions etched into the metallic surfaces, patterns resembling branching timelines twisting around one another like braided strands of light, some of them fractured, others abruptly terminating as though erased mid-sequence. The deeper they moved, the more the air thickened with a low-frequency hum that resonated in their bones, a sensation that felt less like sound and more like a memory being stirred awake. The staircase finally unfurled into a vast subterranean chamber shaped like an inverted dome, its ceiling a swirling mosaic of reflective plates that shifted in slow gravitational drift as if floating on an unseen current, and beneath those suspended fragments lay a circular platform surrounded by concentric rings engraved with symbols matching those on the archway above. As the protagonist stepped onto the platform, the barrier dissolved into a fine mist that scattered into the air, leaving them exposed once more to the chamber's immense, living silence. A sudden vibration rippled through the rings, causing them to rotate in opposing directions, and the shifting engravings aligned into a single continuous pattern that emitted a dim glow, casting elongated shadows of the protagonist across the curved walls. From the far edge of the chamber, a shadow detached itself from the darkness, a dark humanoid shape whose presence immediately mirrored the silhouette above, though this one moved with a slower, more deliberate drift, as if struggling to maintain cohesion within the confined space. The protagonist reached instinctively for their equipment, only to find that the chamber seemed to suppress the interaction between thought and action, as if the very space were observing and adjusting their responses with cold precision. The humanoid form glided closer, and when it reached the boundary of the glowing rings, its outline warped as though being scanned by an unseen force, Fragments of its shadow peeled away in wisps before reintegrating into its core. The platform beneath the protagonist began to rise slowly, the rings lowering in countermotion, revealing a sunken central mechanism consisting of interlocking crystalline prisms that rotated with mathematical exactness. Each prism contained flickering images, glimpses of the cavern above, the fissure widening, the monoliths shattering, and even moments from earlier in the protagonist's journey rendered as shifting spectral tableaus. The images cycled faster, blending past and present until they converged into a projection that hovered between the protagonist and the silhouette, a luminous sphere mapping threads of intersecting timelines, some dense and interconnected, others faint and isolated, and at the center of it all, a node pulsing with the same rhythm as the cylindrical structure in the cavern above. As the projection stabilized, a tremor surged through the underground chamber, causing the reflective plates overhead to collide softly, producing chimes that echoed like distorted memories. The humanoid silhouette reached toward the projection, and the sphere responded by magnifying one of the timeline threads, a branching path that diverged from the protagonist's steps taken just minutes earlier on the collapsing deck. This path showed a shadow version of the protagonist falling from the bridge, being consumed by the fissure's gravitational pull, and fracturing into multiple flickering forms that vanished into different temporal coordinates. The protagonist felt a chill as the meaning settled. The chamber was not only showing what had happened, but what could have happened, what should have happened, and what had been prevented only because the timeline itself was shifting in real time. The silhouette lowered its arm, turning its featureless head toward the protagonist in a gesture that conveyed neither warning nor threat, but inevitability, as though acknowledging that the path ahead was no longer fixed. The prisms rotated again, locking into a new configuration, and the platform reached its highest point, aligning perfectly with a narrow exit tunnel carved into the far wall. A gust of warm air flowed outward from that passage, carrying with it faint echoes of machinery, whispers of distant voices, and the unmistakable rhythmic thrum of something ancient awakening. With the ground quaking beneath them and the timeline projection dissolving into drifting motes of light, the protagonist stepped off the platform toward the tunnel, aware that the silhouette followed at a distance, its presence neither hostile nor benign but woven into the very fabric of whatever awaited them deeper within the labyrinth of shifting possibilities. As the scorched metal door groaned shut behind her, Lina pushed forward through the wavering haze of heat that still radiated from the ruptured conduit, her pulse thundering with the residual shock of realizing that the entity whispering inside her mind had begun to match her thoughts with perfect cadence, and as she stepped deeper into the corridor, she felt the oppressive gravity of the place shift, not in the physical sense, but in the way the air seemed to tighten with awareness, as though the station itself had started listening, and she whispered under her breath that she would not let the voice take control even as it rolled gently beneath her consciousness like a tide waiting for her to stop resisting, and the lights overhead flickered in erratic pulses that illuminated long streaks of fresh claw-like gouges tearing through the wall plating, their edges still warm, which made her wonder if the thing that left them was close, or if it was moving parallel to her, stalking her from some vantage she could not perceive. And she felt her breath catch when the floor subtly vibrated with a low mechanical hum she had never heard before, something newly awakened or newly aware, and with every step she struggled to separate her own instinctual fear from the entity's quiet thrill that seeped into her bloodstream like static, as though it took delight in how precariously close everything felt to rupture. And just as she reached the intersection where the corridor split into two narrow service tunnels, a sudden surge of pressure throbbed behind her eyes, forcing her to grip the wall to steady herself as fragments of an alien memory burst across her vision. Charred silhouettes drifting through a smoky void, a disassembled machine core floating in pieces around a central crystalline organ that pulsed with something like longing, and the unmistakable sensation that this was not merely a memory but a warning accompanied by the faint impression that someone or something was searching for her specifically, as though her presence had triggered an ancient lock. And when she snapped back to the corridor, gasping, she noticed the air had grown colder, sharp enough to bite at the exposed skin of her wrists, and the emergency lights dimmed until the space around her was drenched in an almost liquid darkness that trembled at the edges of her vision. And the voice inside her finally broke its silence, murmuring that the corridor to the right would collapse if she entered it, that the vibrations in the plating were already fracturing the structural welds, and though she hated how calmly it predicted disaster, she could feel that it wasn't lying, could sense the faint microcrack spiderwebbing below the flooring like brittle ice. And so she forced herself down the left passage instead, where the ceiling arched lower and the metallic stench of oxidized coolant grew overwhelming, and as she advanced she saw the distant glimmer of a pulsating red glow that looked like a heartbeat echoing through the dark, and it dawned on her that the station's internal failsafes, a network she had previously believed to be automated, were reorganizing themselves in real time, shifting protocols according to a logic she could not decipher. and the voice in her thoughts whispered with uneasy reverence that something had taken control of the mainframe and was shaping it according to a design that had been dormant for centuries. And as she rounded the final corner, the source of the red glow came into view. A vast circular aperture, newly formed, its inner rings rotating slowly like the iris of a camera lens, opening to reveal a cavernous chamber beyond, filled with swirling dust patterns that drifted as though directed by unseen currents. And Lina felt the air pull toward the opening as if the structure were inhaling, tasting her presence, and she steeled herself as the ground trembled more insistently, because she knew that if she crossed that threshold she would be stepping into the heart of whatever intelligence had been waiting, watching, orchestrating. And before she could take another step, a sudden metallic groan shuddered through the corridor as a segment of the ceiling tore free and crashed behind her, sealing the passage she had come from, forcing her forward into the widening aperture just as the red glow intensified to a blinding crimson and the air snapped with a static surge that made every hair on her arms rise. And she realized with a jolt that she had not misread the sensation of being watched. The entity within the chamber had sensed her crossing the boundary and was now fully awake, turning its attention toward her like a predator opening its eyes after a long hibernation. Its awareness brushing against her mind with a cold, probing curiosity that made her feel like a thread being drawn into a loom of incomprehensible design. And as she involuntarily stepped into the chamber's expanding light, she felt the structural plates beneath her shift into a perfectly smooth surface that reconfigured itself beneath her feet. And the voice inside her whispered that the threshold had been waiting for her alone, an anchor point seeking the one consciousness that could survive what came next. And as the aperture sealed shut behind her with a deafening metallic snap, she realized there was no turning back, and a final tremor rippled through the chamber floor as a towering silhouette stirred in the red fog ahead, its form massive, its edges indistinct, and even though she could not see its face, she knew with instinctive certainty that it was looking directly at her, and that it had been expecting her. That wraps up our analysis of the Anomaly Vector in Episode 5. But the discussion is just beginning. I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think is the ultimate source of the Anomaly Vector that shattered the Citadel's judgment? Drop your theories in the comments below, and let's discuss it. If you found this breakdown insightful, please smash that like button, it helps tremendously. And to continue the journey, click on Episode 6, the Fractured Architect showing on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next deep dive.